This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Actually, Agun Chodesh, Chanukah, Tadar V'Sheina Tadar, Tadar Kaidem. Usually on Tuesdays we learn Ezra, but we have a klal that whenever Tuesday is Rosh Chodesh and Chanukah, then we learn something about Chanukah. So, but it is a shiur on Tanakh, so we're going to learn about Tehillim. We'll keep to that at least. So we know that after davening, during the 8 days of Chanukah, we say the Kapitel Lamed, Mizmar Shiur Chanukah Sabayis LeDavid. Yeah, very beautiful Mizmar. Now it's very interesting that the Gra, it's recorded in the Ma'aser Rav. The Ma'aser Rav brings down the Minhagim of the Gra. In Ois Reish Mem Aleph, the Gra said, now we know the Gra was not a big proponent of saying things after davening, this we mentioned before. Right? The Gra did not say David Hashem V'Yishi. All the later addendums to the end of the tefillah, the Gra held you don't do. You can't add to the davening. But nevertheless, the Gra was of now the Shir Shel Yom is very important. The Shir Shel Yom, it's a Mishnah. Shir Shel Yom is a Mishnah at the end of Tamid. But the Gra held that on Chanukah there's a different Shir Shel Yom. You don't say the Shir Shel Yom.
Every Yontif.
Every Yontif. But the Chiddush is even Chanukah, which is only Drabanan, right? The Chiddush is the Gra held. Look at that Shir Shel Yom for Chanukah is Kapitel Lamed. So you would think then that if we're saying Mizmar Shiur Chanukah Sabayis David, and the Gra held this is so vital and so important that it replaces and supplants the regular Shir Shel Yom, you would think, you know what it would be about? You would think it would be about Chanukah, or about the inauguration of the Beis HaMikdash. Bruchim Habayim. You would think that it would be about the inauguration of the Beis HaMikdash. So David HaMelech starts off saying, Mizmar Shiur Chanukah Sabayis LeDavid, and guess what? He doesn't say not a word about Chanukah, and not a word about the Chanukah Sabayis. Yes, Shkoyach. So that's the title of the. Imagine if you wrote a composition, right, in high school, and you wrote, this composition is about birds migrating to the south. And instead you wrote a composition of how your wife makes cholent. You're not going to get a good mark on that composition. So David HaMelech starts off, Mizmar Shiur Chanukah Sabayis LeDavid, and then he says, thank you Hashem for healing me from my sickness.
His intent is for the Beis HaMikdash, which Shlomo is going
Fine, beautiful. But why he doesn't say a word about it in the whole kapitel? What's the kapitel about? Hashem, thank you for saving me from my enemies. Thank you for healing me. Right? A heading is usually supposed to encapsulate what the chapter is going to be about. So he starts with Mizmar Shiur Chanukah Sabayis David, and then he says, Rebbe Hashem, thank you for healing me from my sickness. Thank you for saving me from my enemies. That's a nice kapitel to write for a day of Thanksgiving. But what does it have to do with Chanukah Sabayis David? It has nothing to do with the Beis HaMikdash. Not a word of the Beis HaMikdash is mentioned. You would think he would write about thank you Hashem for the Mizbeach, for the Menorah, for the Shulchan, for the Aron. Not one word here has anything to do with anything.
What about Lahodos Lahalel?
What does it have to do with Beis HaMikdash? He's writing a chapter thanking Hashem that He's inaugurating the Beis HaMikdash. There's not a word about the Beis HaMikdash or what you do in the Beis HaMikdash. What do you do in the Beis HaMikdash? Karbanos, Avoida, nothing about anything here. It's thank you Hashem that you healed me. What does David being healed have to do with the Beis HaMikdash? What did David being saved from his enemies have to do?
He was able to lay.
But Chanukah has to do with the Beis HaMikdash.
Yeah, but what is? We want to, why?
How can you speak about the Beis HaMikdash? Beis HaMikdash was not built at that time.
No, but he laid the groundwork for it.
So we're going to learn today a piece from the Sefer She'eres Yosef, Chelik Daled, Siman Nun Aleph. She'eres Yosef are the Chidushim of Rav Shlomo Halevi Wahrman, Rabbi Wahrman, who lived in this neighborhood. He was Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Nassau County, and he was one of the Talmud Muvak of Rabbi Lezer Silver. He lived in his house in Cincinnati, and he was a prolific writer, Rabbi Wahrman. He wrote 7 volumes on Shas. He wrote a sefer on Yom Naram, Oros Yimei Rachamim. He wrote a sefer on Pesach, Oros Yimei Pesach. He wrote a sefer on Hilchos Shabbos, Oros HaShabbos. He wrote a sefer on Sukkah, Oros Chag HaSukkos, and he wrote 2 works of history.
And he lived here?
He lived on the block of Chavetz Chaim. Yeah. And beside from that, he was a prolific writer of in Torah journals. He wrote Kemat, every edition of the Hamar, and also in Hapardes, and many. And also they came out. They collected all of his journal writings in a sefer called Koil Avinoyam. Okay.
So he had what to say.
He had what to say. I haven't been very close with him.
He came
And,
from Cincinnati?
What?
He came from Cincinnati?
I think he grew up there. He actually came from Leipzig, Germany,
Well,
and he wrote 2 books about life in Leipzig before the war. Very interesting. So anyway, he brings this question down. He brings this question, and by the way, I remember in his last days, he told me he got a call from Rav Shmuel Halevi Vosner, the Shevet Halevi in Eretz Yisrael, and he was telling the Shevet Halevi, he can't write anymore, and the Shevet Halevi said, no, you're mechuyev to keep on writing. You have to keep on writing. The Shevet Halevi called him to keep on writing. I know his farm were held in very high esteem by Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and the Stipler. I remember he once told me, this is Rosh Chodesh, so I'll say it over. He told me he was in the Stipler's house on Rosh Chodesh. Somebody asked the Stipler, why is it that in the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh you add the words in U'lechaparas Pasha, right? In an Ibr year, in a leap year,
Right.
you add in the words what? U'lechaparas Pasha. Well, only in a leap year, not in that. What's that all about?
Yeah.
In a leap year, you stick in words. Well, you have more time because it's an extra month, so you have an extra month. What am I going to do in the extra month? Okay, I'll say the Chaparas Pasha. So Stipler said like this. In that tefillah, we say Chadesh Aleinu es hachodesh hazeh l'tayva v'livracha l'sasayin l'simcha l'yishua l'nechama l'varnasa l'chakala l'chaim l'shalayim l'mchilas ches l'chazavayin. 12 tefillahs.
1 per month.
1 per month. Each one corresponds to a different month. But when you have another month in the year, you add another tefillah. Chaparas Pasha is connected the extra month. So they asked the Stipler, why Kaparas Pasha for the extra month? The Stipler said, you have an extra month to sin, you need extra kapara. Right? That's it.
So why do you stop in this?
of course, that was that.
Yoitzazayin, that, you got it.
That was the extra.
Okay. Anyway, so that's just a little introduction about Wahrman. So he brings down over here number 4. This is Mamish, a Ga'onistic piece. Amazing piece. Number 3 in your sheet. But Tehillim Parak Lamed Ksiv Mizmar Shir Chanukah Sabayis LaDavid Arei Mimcha Hashem Kidu Isani V'loi Simachta Oivai Li V'hi'iru ha'achroinim. The Achroinim point out the Harei Kol HaParak Mishtoi B'hoidas David LaHashem Yisvarach. The whole parak talks about David thanking Hashem Al Shagaloi Mitzaroisa, that Hashem redeemed him from his distress. Umahu HaKesher Mizeh L'Chanukas Habayis. What connection does this have to the inauguration of the Beis Hamikdash? Shehi HaKoiseres. You know what the Koiseres is? That's the title. That's the, when you write an article, but the article has a title. And the Koiseres is the title. Shokol HaMizmar. It's the heading of the whole Mizmar. V'chol HaMizmar miyusad aleh. It's an amazing thing. You can learn a lot of very interesting things, but it's an amazing explanation. Who built the first Beis Hamikdash? Shlomo Melech. Did David build the first Beis Hamikdash? No, he could not. Why couldn't he? Because Rebbeinu Shalom said, your hands are
Too much blood.
spilled blood. Did David have anything to do with the construction?
Yes.
He did all the planning.
There is one item of the Beis Hamikdash that David activated. What is that?
He bought the land.
Look, v'hanira b'zel loimer. Hine isa b'Rashi b'zvachim. If you look in Rashi Masechta Zvachim, the after Shlomo bana es habayis, even though Shlomo built the Beis Hamikdash, mikamakam David kidesh es haritzba. David sanctified the floor. He sanctified the floor b'shtei taidos, by bringing 2 carbon taidos, uv'shir shel pagam, and with a special song. Fine. Now it's very interesting.
His back was already built. The floor was already built, and his back was built.
The floor.
Before he passed away.
He sanctified. Yes. Yeah.
Really?
Oh, he sanctified the floor. Now
The floor, meaning that
the Ritzpah. He sanctified. No, they built the floor. But you have to be mekadesh it. David was mekadesh it by bringing 2 karbanos and by singing a special shira. It's very interesting. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz writes that the reason why when you're in the Beis Hamikdash you don't wear shoes or socks is because the Ritzpah injected you with tremendous chachmas HaTorah, and therefore there couldn't be any mechitza, any hefsek between your skin and the floor. But now we understand a little bit, because who sanctified the floor of the Beis HaMikdash? David HaMelech. Now how was he mekadesh it? The Taida and with a shear. So Tosfos points out that, does anybody know what's the process of sanctifying something in the Beis HaMikdash? You need 4 ingredients. You know what you need? You need a king, you need a melech, you need the Navi, you need the prophet, you need the Urim V'Tumim, and you need the Sanhedrin of 71. To sanctify anything in the Beis HaMikdash, you need 4 ingredients: melech, Navi, Urim V'Tumim, Sanhedrin.
Is that, no, wait a minute. Kutchel Shaita or Kutchel...
First Beis HaMikdash. First Beis HaMikdash.
Yeah, so when he did when he had made it Kodesh,
Yeah.
is it Shaita or Leolam Vayed?
Well, that's debatable. The Rambam says...
Have all those 4...
The Rambam says Kedushas Yushalayim, Kedushas HaMikdash is La'ilam. Right? So look what he says. Uv'taisis sham hevi mehar Yushami b'shvus. Taisis brings Yushami. To hakidush haya kedin kiddush ha'azara. The sanctification came as a result of the same type of sanctifying that they did to the Azara. Shetzarch melech, the Navi, v'urim v'tumim, the Sanhedrin. Ukadisa b'shuvas. So let me ask you a question. If they sanctified the floor, who was the melech? David. The David, Zamelech. Who was the Navi? God. God and Navi. God. God was David's Navi. Umavor, we see from here. Demahani Kidusha Shal David. Why was David's sanctification successful? Rak Mishum Dahayadin Demelech Alav. Only because David had the status of being a king. Okay.
What's the Chiddush on that? He was on
Okay.
Malchus Rock.
We'll see what the Chiddush is. Now, here's the thing. First they sanctified the floor, and then what did they sanctify after that? The Azara. Now, if we look in the Gemara in Shavuos and Daf Tezvav, Ayin b'Shavuos Tezvav, Ein Azar miskadeshes ela b'shiyarei mincha. In order to sanctify the Azara, you needed the remnants of the carbon mincha. But here's the problem. Tosfos asks, there's a man Amar that you can't bring a mincha unless you have a mizbeach. You can't bring a mincha on a bama. A taida maybe you could bring on a bama. So David's carbon, but the mincha you can't bring on a bama. You can't bring a mincha on a bama. So think about it. How are they mekadesh the Azara with the mincha? What'd they bring the mincha on? The mizbeach? There is no mizbeach without an Azara. You hear this? Now we're up to the Azara. How are they mekadesh the Azara? With a mincha. How did they bring the mincha?
Didn't you say that he was, when he did the ritzvah, he did the Azara?
No. He did the ritzvah. He was mekadesh the ritzvah in the same procedure as how they were mekadesh the Azara. But the Azara needs one added ingredient. The Azara needs a mincha.
Which is a higher level carbon, the Toda or the Mincha?
It does. There's an ingredient. A mincha needs a mizbeach.
And the Toda doesn't
No.
use as well?
No. Taida is kosher.
You weren't allowed to use bamos.
But now there was no Beis
You had the
HaMikdash.
Beis HaMikdash.
Yeah, but you didn't have the Beis HaMikdash
You had
yet.
the Ritzvah.
No, so that's not a Beis. But now the problem is the mincha needs a mizbeach. So how they bring the mincha? But the Azara, if the Azara needs the mincha, so you don't have an Azara without the mincha, you don't have a mizbeach either. I mean, it's circular. How they make the Azara with the mincha? How they make the mincha?
Chicken or the egg.
You can't bring a mincha without an Azara.
You can't have an Azor without a Mincha.
Can't have Azara without a mincha. So how they get it started? If the Azara needs the mincha needs the Azara, how they get to first base?
As they're building the
You can steal first. You can steal first.
you're bringing the
So you're saying you could steal first. You could steal first base. So listen to this. So Wahrman says he heard a chiddush from Rabbi Lezer Silver. He used to say over from Rabbi Lezer Silver that Rabbi Lezer was a goin atzam. I don't know, maybe this was in the 50s. Rabbi Lezer Silver once got up to speak at the Aguda convention, and he said, "State in the Yerushalmi in 6 places." So there's a guy there, also big Talmid Chacham, a little bit of a chutzpah yak. He gets up, 7 places. Blazer Silver stands up. He pulls out of his wallet a $100 bill. In 1950, $100, big money.
Real money.
That was a lot of money.
But that's when rabbis had a lot
He
of
said, yeah, that's the good old days. He says, "State in the Yishalmi in Peah Dapis, in the Maida Shvis, in 6 places, and if you could find me a 7th, it's yours." He was a sharp Talmid Chacham. Anyway, he says like this. Says Rabbi Blazer Silver, "Ulai ayadei kiddush haritzvah." Maybe when David sanctified the ritzvah, which doesn't need the mincha, just needs the taida, Paal David was effectuated. L'salik din de bama me'amakim. He was able to extricate. He was able to remove the mizbeach status of a bama. Mi pasha yadin de melech alav. So listen to Rabbi Blazer Silver's chiddush. That when David sanctified the ritzvah, that removed now the mizbeach was no longer a mizbeach.
You mean the bum was no longer a bum?
That area, that altar, was no longer a bama. Right? That bama was no longer a bama. How? How did David do that? It was through the kiddush of the ritzvah. So think about it. According to this chiddush, how were they able to be mekadesh the azara? So David was mekadesh the ritzvah. By him being mekadesh the ritzvah, the bama wasn't a bama anymore; it was a mizbeach. Now they could bring the mincha. Now that they bring the mincha, they can be mekadesh the azara. But it all comes back to David HaMelech sanctifying the ritzvah, right? So you got it? Again, the question was, how were they ever able to mekadesh the azara? The azara needs a mincha, and you can't bring a mincha on a bama. So what's the answer? When David sanctified the ritzvah, that extricated the status of bama from the mizbeach.
So we also have to say that bama that David HaMelech made Kodesh had the exact specifications of the mizbeach by his Rishon?
No.
How could you bring a mincha on a mizbeach that wasn't inspect?
No, you can't bring a mincha on a bama.
Right.
So now it's not a bama anymore.
So it doesn't have to be brought.
Doesn't have to be the positive mizbeach as long as it's not doesn't have the psul of a bama. That's the chiddush of Blazer Silver. That David HaMelech was effective, was successful in removing the status of bama from the Makom Mizbeach. Okay, fine. So what we're learning is, bottom line, who's responsible for the Beis HaMikdash? David. Without David, being Mekadosh the Ritzvah, they could have never sanctified anything.
Well, Shlomo could have done it. He was a melech.
No, how? How's he going to do it?
He's a melech.
He could have done it. But if not, but David did it. If not for he used his status of melech to mekadosh the ritzvah that allowed to bring the mincha and the makom hamizbeach, which allowed for the kedusha, the azar, and the whole Beis HaMikdash. Fine.
What about the whole idea of the blood on his hands? That why should he have the ability?
So he didn't build it; he sanctified it. And by the way, Rabbi Yonasan Eibishitz has a whole explanation what that means. What's wrong with blood on his hands? A moyel can't build the Beis HaMikdash because he has blood on his hands. So what did David do wrong?
So that was a mitzvah. That's a mitzvah.
David was doing a mitzvah, mechaves mitzvah. What's the difference? It's a tremendous mitzvah. What's wrong? He was mechayiv to do it.
He's a problem. Otherwise, why would have been
so there's a whole explanation for that.
He did all the plans.
A whole explanation. Very interesting. But in any event, if I were to ask you, David Melech Yisrael, during his career as king, was there ever a time that he lost the status of being a king? So we're going to examine today 2 periods in the history of David where his status of being king was up in the air. Very interesting. So now take a look. The next paragraph, I think on your sheet it's the bottom right hand paragraph. With the Sanhedrin Mavia HaGemara Kra, the Malachim Aleph, Parak Aleph. The Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Kuf Zayin asks the following contradiction. It says in Malachim Aleph, Parak Aleph, Hayamim Asher Malach David al Yisrael. Here are the number of years that David ruled over Yisrael, over Israel. Arba'im Shana b'Chevron, Malach. Arba'im Shana. He ruled for 40 years. David was Melech Yisrael for 40 years. B'Chevron Malach Shavashan, Yerushalayim Malach Shoshim Mishash. David ruled in Chevron 7 and in Yerushalayim 33. That's what it says in Malachim Aleph. But you're probably jumping out of your skin because you remember in Shmuel Beis and Parakeh, it says he ruled in Chevron 7 years and 6 months. So how could it say in Malachim he ruled for 7 years, but in Shmuel it says 7 years and 6 months? Ulam, B'Shmuel Beis Parakei Ksiv, the Bechevron Malach Al Yehuda, Sheva Shanim, the Shisha Chadashim, 7 years and 6 months. It's a stira, right? And often a stira.
He just rounded it off the first time.
In Malachim it says 7 years and 6 months, and in Shmuel it says. See, right, in Malachim it says 7 years, and in Shmuel it says 7 years, 6 months.
Must have been on leave of absence for 6 months.
Umasik b'Gemara. The Gemara concludes, the Hani Shisha Chadashim, like Chashav. We're not counting 6 months. The Pasuk in Malachim doesn't count 6 months. Mishum dinit stareya, because he had saras. David HaMelech had saras. Uperish Rashi. So Rashi says just because he had, a skin condition, he's not the king. Why wouldn't we count 7 years and 6 months? Perish Rashi. Deloi haisa malchusa shlema. His malchus was not complete because he had saras. The Achronim explain, what do you mean his malchus wasn't complete? What was he lacking? Ubiyaruhu Achronim. L'fri divrei haGemara in Hariyos. Does anybody know, if you're a nasi and you do an avera, you don't bring the regular carbon that every other Jew brings, a kisva or a seira. You bring what's called the sa'ir of a nasi. But a nasi who has saras loses his status of being a nasi. He no longer brings the sa'ir of the nasi. Now he only brings the carbon of a hedyot, a kisva or a seira. The Gemara in Hurrius and Daf Yud says, Asher nasi yachta, prat le nasi shenit stareya. This excludes a nasi that has saras. Shenemar, vayinaga Hashem es-hamelach, vayhi mitzayra ad yoim moisai, vayashav beveis hachavshus. It's talking about the king. The king had saras, and he's sitting in the Freedom Tower. Right? Not the New World Trade, not the new Twin Towers.
You only bring the carbon after the saras goes away, right? You can't bring the carbon when you have the saras.
Or you could send it. You could have it sent, maybe.
No, what I'm getting at is if you have to bring the carbon afterwards, when the saras clears up, so isn't your status reinstated?
No, because it goes by when you did the Avera. If you did the Avera as a Mitzayra, so why does it say that the king was in the Freedom Tower? What's the Freedom Tower? What's the Beis HaChavshus? Perish Rashi. Denafse Chavshi min Amalchus. He became free from his rulership. Kehedyot dami. He's like a commoner. Meino maybe sire. What?
Don't you have to go to quarantine if you have...
yeah.
So he was in quarantine.
It's the Freedom Tower.
Yeah. So what does it mean he was free? He was free from the Malchus. So what do we learn from here? That a king who has saras is not a melech. He's a hedyot. Well, if he's there, comes out, those months that David had saras, David nidon kehedyot. David was a commoner. Below haya alav din de melech.
And we had no melech, there was no substitute.
He did not have the status of the king. So if I were to ask you, how long was David king for? Well, 40 years.
40 years.
But 6 months, 6 months, he was out. He did not have the status of a melech. He had the status of a hedyot. When was that? When he had saras.
No. So he actually served as king for 40 years. But the time was 40 years and 6 months.
Right, the time that his career expanded.
He served as melech for 40 years.
Correct. So that's one time in the history of David that David was not able to act as melech. There's one other time. Look at the next paragraph. The truth is, Gami pa'asiba acheres. There's another reason that nistalik din de melech me David ba'oisem vav chadashim. That David lost his status of being king during those very 6 months. Dina Isa b'Yushalmi b'Rosh Hashanah v'Harias. Because we find in the Yerushalmi in Rosh Hashanah, and you're thinking it's in Harias also in the Yerushalmi, right? Yeah, it is. You're right. It's also in the Yerushalmi in Harias. Da'oisem vav chadashim, deloi kachashiv. Those 6 months that the Pasuk in Malachim doesn't mention, you know what else happened during those 6 months? Someone was chasing after David. Who was chasing after David? Avshalom. David was running from Avshalom. V'amar Rav Huna, during those 6 months, David did not bring a carbon of a king. He would bring the carbon of a commoner.
He's running away. How can he be in Kabbanis? Then he'd be out.
You have a bomber, right?
Yeah. So here's the question. Why during those 6 months did he bring the carbon of the commoner? So Rabbi Kiva Eger on the Yerushalmi says, I'll tell you why. Because he was a Mitzayra, and a Mitzayra is not a Melech. Because those 6 months that he's running away from Avshalom also were the 6 months. No, right. They overlap. Two things are happening. So Rabbi Kiva Eger is observing the fact that the 6 months he was running away from Avshalom, he brought the carbon of a commoner. Says Rabbi Kiva Eger, you know why? Because he was a Mitzayra. That's why he brought the carbon of a commoner. Uvagoin Hashasham, Rosh Hashanah Kasav. Is there a Yerushalmi here?
I don't know.
Yeah, they have some Yerushalmi. Oh, what do you know? Rabbi Kiva Eger in the Yerushalmi says that why during those 6 months did David bring the carbon of a commoner? Because he was a Mitzayra. Because he was a Mitzayra. I don't know. We'll take his word for it. But because he was a Mitzayra. That's what Rabbi Kiva Eger says. That those 6 months that David was running from Avshalom, why would he bring the carbon of a commoner? Because they were the very 6 months that he had Saras, the Shuvhayim Eskaper Kedyot. But the Parshas Drachim argues on Rabbi Kiva Eger. And the Parsha, you know who wrote the Parshas Drachim? The Mishnah Lamelech wrote a sefer taking all the episodes in Chumash and making Lamdisha Machlekesen. In other words, you have a conversation between the brothers and Yosef. It wasn't an ordinary conversation. They were arguing in Halacha whether they had the status of Yisrael, even the Kula. The whole sefer, he has different ma'amorim, makes every conversation between anybody in the Chumash is all hinges on different lamdish points. Parshas Drachim says, I'll tell you, there's aside from the fact that he was a Mitzayra, there's another reason why during those 6 months David brought a carbon like a commoner. Ulam b'Parshas Drachim b'derech HaMelech b'Drushiral v'Yibez Mavur d'mi pa'as b'richasa me'Avshalom greda. Because David was running away from Avshalom alone, Kvar Nifka Mimenu Din de Melech. David lost his status of being king. You know why? Because the people weren't following David anymore, they were following Avshalom. So since David HaMelech lost his status of being king, and since David HaMelech, people were not following him anymore, so he lost his status of being king. And the Radak says the same thing. And he quotes from the Chida, in the name of the Meiri, that a Nasi only has a din of a Nasi when he's machzik in his malchus. Right? It's very interesting.
Why is it mattered about Avshalom if he was Mitzorah?
You'll see. You'll see. You're right. It's just another reason. In other words, Rabbi Kiva Eger says, during the time that he was a Mitzorah, the fact that Avshalom was running after him, that alone would not make him lose the status of being Melech. It's just the fact that he was a Mitzorah. Parshas Drachim says there are two ingredients here. Two causes that would have made him lose his status of being king. Number one, he's a Mitzayra. Number two, he's running away from Avshalom. Because in order to be a king, it says, Soim Tasim Alecha Melech, that the king has to act with a certain degree of srara. You have to act with royalty, as an authoritarian figure. You have to act with authority. A king who doesn't have srara is not a king. So when someone's a mitzayra and he's isolated and he can't have any contact with people, what kind of authority does he have? What kind of srara does he have? But the same thing, if someone is being chased for his life and someone's running after them, that's not a king. That's a king. When Avshalom is running after David and David's fleeing, and people see David running down the street, running from Avshalom, that ain't a king. A king is someone who's sitting in his palace. When he says something, people quake. Not people are running after him. So the Parshas Drachim is of the opinion that there were two reasons why David, during those 6 months, did not have the full status of king. Number one, he's a Mitzayra. Number two, someone's chasing after him. Ulafizeh, look in the next paragraph. Ba'oisam vav chadashim. During those 6 months, Lo hava din de melech al David. David lost his status of being king. Mi pas beis sibos. Because of two reasons. Mipas Meridas Avshalom, because Avshalom rebelled, according to the Parshas Drachim. Mipas Sarataim, because of his saras. And for those two causes, had he done an Avera, he would not have brought the sire of the Nasi, he would have brought in a Kisfor Seir like anybody else. But when Avshalom was killed, and when Hashem healed him from his saras, his Malchus was restored. So listen to the following cheshbon. Ulefizeh. I'll say it outside, then we'll read it. What would have happened had he remained a Mitzrayim and Avshalom would have continued to run after him? He never would have been able to Mekadesh the Ritzvah. Now, if he wouldn't have been able to Mekadesh the Ritzvah, the Mizbeach would have been a Bama. If the Mizbeach would have been a Bama, they couldn't have brought the Shiur Mincha. They couldn't bring the Shiur Mincha. The Mizbeach would not, the Beis HaMikdash would not have had its Kedusha. So according to this, Lefizeh, Lule Hashem Sha'azalai, had Hashem not helped him, then it's Chaynoi al Avshalom, and his victory on Avshalom, Ur V'fua is Tzarata, and healing him from his tzaras, Lo Hava Lov Shuv Din de Melech, he would not have had the status of king, Lo Haya B'yadei L'Kadesh Es HaRitzvah, he would not have been able to sanctify the Ritzvah. Now we understand, Mizmar Shiur, Chanukahs, Habayis L'David.
He healed him from these illnesses.
He says, Ribbono Shel Olam,
Mizmor
Shiur Chanukahs Habayis L'David. I'm going to sing a song for the inauguration of the Beis HaMikdash. You know what made it possible? Number one, Arei Mimcha Hashem, I'll praise you, Ki Dilisani, that you lifted me up. V'lo simachta, oy vayli, you didn't allow my enemy to rejoice over me. Who's his enemy? Avshalom. Hashem Elokai, Shivati Elecha, I cried out to you. Vater Pa'ini, and you healed me from my tzaras. So now I'm a melech. Hashem, a mitzayra is chashuv kemeis. Hashem, ha'elisa min sha'al nafshi. You brought up my soul from the pit. Chisani, miyar dibar. You gave me life again. A mitzayra is chashuv kemeis. Says Rabbi Wahrman here, back in the piece. Bahashta move and hatev. Now we understand very well. Hada Amar David Mizmor Shiur Chanukahs Habayis. Why does he say this? V'nagel legulasim mitzaroisav. Dehariyosa Chanukahs Habayis shezacha David liyos lechilik ba. What shiur did David have in the Chanukahs Habayis? He sanctified the Ritzvah. How was he able to sanctify the Ritzvah? Because he had the status of a melech. That's why he says, Arei Mimcha Hashem ki dilisani. You saved me from Avshalom. Hashem Elokai, Shivati Elecha, Vater Pa'ini. And perhaps that's what we say, says Rabbi Wahrman at the end of the parak. David HaMelech says, Hafachta mispedi l'machal. You transformed my mourning. Who did David mourn for? Who did David mourn for? Avshalom. He mourned for Avshalom. But that mourning was transformed into Lamachali for a dancing. Why? Because now that Avshalom is dead, I could be a melech again. I could be Mekadesh the Ritzvah. Pitachta Saki. I took off my sackcloth. We know a Mitzrayim keeps Dinei Avelos. A Mitzrayim keeps Dinei Avelos. A Mitzrayim is mechuyev to act like an Avel. Like the Gemara Moikatan says. A Mitzrayim is Asur B'Shel HaShalom Ka'avel. He sits Mechus HaRosh. Ve'oite al Safam like an Avel. So, Pitachta Saki, God, you removed my sackcloth from my Avelos of being a Mitzrayim. B'atazreini Simcha, and you girded me with joy that now I have the status of Melech. I was able to be Mekadesh the Ritzvah. Now the Mizbeach is Mizbeach. They could bring the Shiur Mincha, and they could be Mekadesh the Azara.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.